All right. Well, my name is Stephanie Frostad, and I'm an artist living and working here in Missoula, Montana. This is my painting, Return of the Prodigal Son, from 2009. It's oil on canvas. I have often worked with myths and stories, including some Bible stories through the years, as a source for narratives that I might not so much illustrate, but interpret. The thing I found intriguing about the parable when I set out to work with it was that the prodigal son was an easy villain for me. I'd sort of cast him that way. And I wanted to give some space to the dutiful son, who, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of paintings of the prodigal son and the return of the prodigal son specifically. But there aren't any paintings of the dutiful son. I mean, where he appears in any of this imagery is very slight, if at all. And as I got involved with the imagery, I realized how hard it is to portray his story, because his journey is more interior. He has to reconcile with his brother somehow. And what that looks like is a little harder to portray than, for example, the prodigal son debauching himself with prostitutes and liquor, or him being destitute and living among the swine. In this scene, it's sort of the resolution of the parable. The prodigal son returns, rather rejected, but he's greeted warmly by his parents. And in the middle ground, we find the dutiful son sort of poised between that happy homecoming, about which he's ambivalent, and the fatted calf that will no doubt be slaughtered for the feast of the prodigal son's return. And I used this element of the sort of grand gate or entry to the farm to frame the gulf between them. These cows, I think the overall sense is one of nurturance and abundance, and that's there. But the human drama that unfolds beyond it makes other kind of implications about the fate of these creatures and the fate of the land. The rural environment interests me as a setting for my paintings, because the rural environment, even though so many of us live removed from agriculture, continues to supply so many metaphors and be so rooted in our cultural icons and myths that it seems like a very fecund place to set these dramas. I also grew up in a fairly rural environment in Walla Walla, Washington. So there are certain things about living on the land and raising livestock and being attuned to the seasons that I think are just like bred into me at this point. And it's something I like to explore or honor in my artwork. I was trained, I got my early training in Baltimore at the Maryland Institute by a lot of like first and second generation abstract expressionists. And pictorial art wasn't just passé, it was almost taboo. But I realized that I have this narrative impulse. It's a communicative impulse, maybe at bottom. And when I was sort of casting about, trying to find my way or voice in art, the figurative narrative tradition seemed at once most democratic in terms of being able to reach the widest possible audience, and also well within my gifts and interests as an image maker. So I've really dedicated myself to developing the techniques and approaches that make for strong narrative art. And to me, that means not telling the story, but setting it in motion. trying to put the characters in place, provide enough context for them that the viewer can approach the work and start making guesses about what happened before or what might happen next. So that they become the storyteller with the aid of the imagery or the inspiration of the imagery. I want people to be able to discuss my work. And I think that's part of my call to naturalism, because it's accessible. Yeah, you know, I usually have what might be the skeleton of an image in mind. And then I start gathering resources or generating them in terms of photographic references. I have anatomy books and all sorts of things with which I can pose a figure, or for that matter, other animals like the cows that appear here. And sometimes as I go along, I find, you know, the pose that I originally became attached to for a certain character isn't working. So the search begins again, even in the midst of the painting. Very often, in order to come fresh to the canvas, I will have individual studies of just the parts and little more than a thumbnail of what the overall composition will be. I might be concerned with certain arcs that I want to be sure work through the composition in an abstract or formal sense, but how things are arrayed along that sort of armature is a little bit fresher for me when I come to it with color and brushes. These cows were photographed at the Western Montana Fair. I'm always out hunting around for sources of imagery. This figure, the young man who is the dutiful son, is a picture I found based on a picture I found in a book. But I actually modeled for all three of these characters, kind of struck these poses. So that's part of my composite process, for there to be a certain amount of invention. There's a certain amount of me going out in the world to find references photographically, and then of course using either other artworks or photographic works as sources for the imagery. In our culture, there's all this competing vibrancy and noise, which is a very popular aesthetic, like in television or at the movies, or even if you're driving down Reserve Street and each sign wants to be a little brighter or bolder or flashier than the next one. When in fact, I think the most intriguing contrast, those that hold our eye and bring it back again and again, are the subtle ones, where you have two different colors, but they're the same value. And so that subtle vibration in their different temperatures, for example, kind of keeps you interested. There is such a drive toward originality that it almost becomes a distraction from creating authentic work. And so one of my choices was to try not to be original, trusting that what interests me, how I assemble imagery, even if I'm working with a story that's hundreds and hundreds of years old and kind of belongs to the whole world in some form, that it will come out in an authentic way that is unique to me and relevant to my time. I'm Stephanie Frostad. I live and work here in Missoula, Montana, and this is my painting, Return of the Prodigal Son.